All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're diving into something pretty interesting. 10 new press releases straight from ICE's enforcement and removal operations.
Zero.
Yeah, exactly, ERO. And these releases, they all basically announce the apprehension or removal of non-citizens who've committed crimes here in the U.S.
Right. And I think what's so fascinating about these releases, you can really see that tension between, trying to uphold the law and navigating the complexities of immigration.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. And I think, one thing that really stood out to me is that these arrests aren't just, happening in one place. We've got Baltimore, Baton Rouge, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Seattle, even Washington, D.C. So it's like, they're all over.
Yeah, it's definitely nationwide. It's not just isolated incidents. It
Hmm.
feels very strategic.
Yeah, and looking at the nationalities, it's a real mix. I mean, we've got folks from Central and South America, places like Honduras, Brazil, Guatemala, Ecuador,
Yeah.
and then also from Venezuela, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador. It's like, are these specific countries, are they tied to certain types of criminal activity that we're seeing here?
Yeah, we often see that like certain immigration patterns are tied to regions or countries that are known for specific, criminal enterprises.
Yeah.
So, for example, you might have individuals fleeing gang violence in Central America, or maybe others seeking economic opportunities tied to, drug trafficking.
Okay, so locations all over the place, nationalities pretty diverse. But here's where it gets really interesting, the types of offenses. We're not talking about, just minor infractions here. It ranges from assault and drug distribution to even things like sexual battery, aggravated rape, even crimes against children.
And there's another layer too, right? Because we're seeing several cases where the people involved are repeat offenders. So they've been deported, then they re-enter the U.S. illegally, and then in some cases they actually commit even more serious crimes once they're back. It really makes you think about border security and how effective those policies actually are.
Oh yeah, for sure. And speaking of policies, did you notice how many of these press releases actually mention sanctuary city policies? I mean, just for our listeners out there who might not be familiar with the term, these are policies that cities or states put into place that basically limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration agencies. It's like they're trying to protect undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, and these sanctuary city policies come up again and again in these releases. And in several cases, they specifically highlight cases where people were released because of these policies, because ICD detainers weren't honored, and then these individuals went on to commit other crimes.
Yeah, like that case out of Boston with Maynard Francisco Hernandez Rodas. He was charged with aggravated rape of a child, but the court just ignored ICE's detainer request and let him go.
It really illustrates that debate around these sanctuary city policies,
Yeah.
how they affect public safety. Supporters of these policies say that they build trust between immigrant communities and local law enforcement.
Right.
But critics argue that it just creates a safe haven for criminals and puts everyone at risk.
It's a tough one. And these releases, they don't shy away from showing the potential consequences of these policies.
It definitely adds a sense of urgency to the conversation. It's about balancing rights and keeping people safe.
Okay, so we've got this whole local versus federal thing going on, but what about IC themselves? What are they saying about their mission and how they operate?
Well, you see it pretty clearly in the press releases. They really emphasize EORO's mission to protect the homeland and enforce U.S. immigration law. And they often give you specifics about their operations, like fugitive operations, targeted enforcement, and using detainers. And for those who don't know, a detainer is when ICE asks local law enforcement to hold someone for another 48 hours after they're supposed to be released,
Hmm.
so ICE can take them into custody.
Ah, okay, so it's like a little behind the scenes look at how they do things.
Exactly. But it's also important to note that even though they're focused on the crimes these people committed, the releases do say that everyone gets due process in immigration court.
Right, it's not just rounding people up. There's a legal process and they have rights.
Exactly. And that's something that can get lost in all the talk about immigration.
Okay, so we've talked about the geography, the types of offenses, the sanctuary city stuff, and IC's role. But let's look at some specific cases that stood out,
Yeah, there are definitely a few that are unusual or that show the challenges in the system.
for sure. The first one that comes to mind is Carlos Vasquez in Baton Rouge. This one really got me. He was convicted of sexual battery, but get this, he was accidentally released from detention back in 2019.
And he was out there for 5 years before ERO finally caught him.
5 years. That's crazy to think someone convicted of something so serious could just disappear for that long. It makes you think, what went wrong with the system?
Definitely raises some red flags about how effective our detention and monitoring systems are.
Absolutely. Then there's the case of Javier Jose Albornoz Merchan in New York City. Not only was he convicted of having a gun illegally, but he's also a member of the Tren de Aragua gang.
And for everyone listening, Tren de Aragua is a really dangerous criminal organization. They started in Venezuela, and they're involved in all sorts of bad stuff: extortion, kidnapping, drug trafficking, you name it.
And despite ICE asking for him to be held, he was released back into the community twice before they finally got him. It's like a revolving door. Makes you wonder if the policies are actually working, especially when it comes to organized crime that goes beyond our borders.
It's a huge challenge. This case shows how hard it is to deal with crime that's not just contained within the U.S. We need better collaboration and intelligence sharing between agencies here and internationally.
It's like each case is its own little deep dive.
Right. It all ties into the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And the more we look at these individual stories, the more we understand the whole immigration system.
We've covered a lot already, but we still got more cases to go through.
And those last two cases, man, they really make you think.
Mm.
Like each one shows you a different side of the whole immigration system. And it's like more questions than answers sometimes. But hey, I guess that's what we're here for.
Right? Absolutely. We're trying to get into those finer details. But it's also important to remember that these press releases, they really just focus on the crimes and they don't tell the whole story. You know, these individuals still have their day in immigration court where things get examined more closely and they're guaranteed due process. Yeah, that's a good point. These releases are just one piece of the puzzle. There's a whole legal process that happens after, and those rights need to be protected.
It's about finding that balance between upholding the law and making sure everything's fair within the legal system.
You know, going through these cases, one thing that keeps coming up is these ICE detainers. It feels like almost every release mentions a situation where ICE requested a detainer and then local authorities just ignored it.
Right, and that's where those sanctuary city policies come into play.
Yeah.
These specific cases really add fuel to that whole debate about whether those policies actually keep people safe or not.
It's true. In some cases, the people who were released, even though ICE wanted them held, ended up committing more crimes. It makes you wonder where you draw the line. How do you balance the rights of non-citizens with keeping communities safe?
It's a tough one.
Oh.
And there are valid points on both sides.
Yeah.
People who support sanctuary city policies often worry about racial profiling
Yeah.
and whether cooperating with ICE could actually make immigrants less likely to report crimes or help with investigations.
Makes sense.
They think it could damage that trust between immigrant communities and law enforcement.
And then on the other side, you have those who believe that these policies are basically just a way for criminals to avoid consequences.
Exactly. They think that public safety should come first, and that means working with federal immigration enforcement, even if it might alienate some groups.
No easy solutions there. But at least these cases get the conversation started. By looking at these situations, we can start to understand the bigger issues.
I totally agree. It's not about choosing sides, but about having a more informed conversation about these difficult topics.
All right, so we've talked about the geography, the types of offenses, those sanctuary city policies, and the whole due process thing. What else stands out to you as we dig deeper into these individual stories? Like, what are some things we might miss if we just skim these releases?
Well, there are a few things that I think are worth mentioning. Like in the case of Evan Abdulio Ponce Gillen, who was arrested in Maryland. He's from Honduras, and was convicted of assaulting someone in Maryland. Now, the crime itself is serious, but what ICE really emphasizes is that he entered the U.S. illegally.
So it's not just the assault, but the fact that he wasn't supposed to be here in the first place.
Exactly. And that seems to be something they do a lot in these releases, highlighting the fact that people broke immigration laws. It seems like a big part of how they decide who to focus on.
Makes you wonder if he had been here legally, would this even be a news story?
Right. It's like they're trying to make a statement about what happens when you come here illegally, even if the crimes aren't that serious.
Another one that caught my eye was the arrest of a Brazilian national in Martha's Vineyard for drug distribution. You know, we always think about these things happening in cities or border towns, but Martha's Vineyard, it's like a small island community, not exactly what you'd expect.
Yeah, it challenges that idea that ICE only operates in certain places or with certain groups. It shows that they're everywhere and they're paying attention.
It's like no community is immune to this stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It reinforces the fact that immigration enforcement is a nationwide issue.
All right, last one for this round. Juan Carlos Barantes from Washington State. This one was interesting because he wasn't just convicted of drug trafficking here. He's also wanted for similar charges in Costa Rica.
This one really shows how connected these crimes can be across borders and how important it is for countries to work together. We're not just dealing with people who break laws in the U.S., but people who might have a history of criminal activity in other countries, too.
Adds a whole other level to the conversation about public safety. It's not just about protecting American communities, but also about working with other countries to deal with crime that crosses borders.
Exactly. It highlights how interconnected global law enforcement is becoming.
It's giving me a lot to think about. Each case reveals another layer of how complicated immigration is and how sometimes our approach can have unintended consequences.
It's like a puzzle. All the pieces fit together. And the more we look at these cases, the better we understand the challenges law enforcement faces and how difficult it is to find the right balance between security and compassion in our immigration policies.
We've only gone through some of these press releases, and I've already learned so much. Can't wait to see what other insights pop up as we continue our deep dive.
And we are back for our final round of these ICE cases, and you know what? The more we dig into these, the more interesting they get.
Yeah, they really show how complicated all this is.
Okay, so let's see. We've got this case of William Alexander Albanez Herrera, who was deported to El Salvador. He was an MS-13 gang member and wanted for some pretty serious stuff like aggravated homicide and aggravated femicide.
That's a scary reminder of how dangerous gangs can be and how their violence often crosses borders.
And get this, he was already deported back in 2014, but came back illegally.
Shows how determined some people are to get around the law. It's a challenge for the authorities to keep people out once they've been removed. You hear about MS-13 all the time, but this case really shows how brutal they can be and how far their network reaches.
It's a reminder that law enforcement needs to be strong both here and in other countries to stop these groups.
Okay, then there's this case from New York City about Darwin Andres Gomez Izquiel, who attacked some NYPD officers in Times Square.
What's interesting about this one is that he was caught at the border several times. He was even sent back to Mexico voluntarily once, but he still managed to get to New York and cause trouble.
It really shows how hard it is to control the borders and how some people will keep trying to get in even after being deported.
It raises questions about whether our border security is strong enough and if we have the resources to deal with all this.
And this case also touches on that sanctuary city thing again. Gomez Izquiel was released after being charged with the assault, and even though ICU wanted to hold him, he wasn't taken into custody until after he served his sentence.
Yeah, it shows that conflict between local places that want to build trust with immigrants and federal agencies that are supposed to enforce immigration laws.
It's hard to find that balance between keeping everyone safe, protecting individual rights, and making sure the community trusts the system.
Definitely. These cases show what happens in the real world when you try to approach immigration enforcement in different ways.
Well, I think we finally made it through all of our press releases. It's been quite a journey.
We've looked at a lot of different cases, each with its own twists and turns.
We talked about the trends in these cases, the types of crimes the sanctuary city issue, the role of ICE, and why due process is so important.
What I think is really valuable is that these stories show us how immigration enforcement works in the real world.
Absolutely. It's a system where everyone's trying to figure out the best way to do things and where the decisions have real consequences.
It starts conversations about the challenges law enforcement faces, the effects of immigration policies, and how to make a system that's both secure and humane.
So as we wrap things up today, think about what you've learned. How do these stories change your view of immigration? What questions do they raise for you about the future of immigration in this country?
Those are important questions to consider because we all need to be informed and engaged to create a fair and just society.
Understanding all the sides of this issue is crucial to having productive conversations and finding solutions that work for everyone.
Thanks for joining us today.
And until next time, keep digging deeper.